Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody joining in to the webinar, Equitable Sharing of Benefits from Genetic Resources, Gender and Social Justice in the Age of DSI. My name is Meenal, and I would like to welcome you all on behalf of Women for Biodiversity. I would also want to acknowledge that our collaborators on this webinar are the Ministry of Environment of Peru and the Third World Network, and we are very thankful and honored for this opportunity to collaborate with them. Shruti, next slide. So before we begin, I have a few technical announcements. May I request everybody to please keep their microphones muted so as to not disturb our panelists for today when they're speaking. I would also like to announce that we have interpretation available in Spanish and French for the duration of this webinar. So to tune in and listen to us in your preferred language, you can click on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen and choose the language of your choice. Also a request to our panelists to speak slowly and clearly so that our interpreters can support us because this webinar is on a very technical topic. We also hope to have a small question and answer session after the panelists have finished speaking. So please type your questions in the Q&A box below or in the chat box. So let's start. Next slide, Shruti. So as we know, digital sequence information refers to digital data that represents sequences of nucleotides in genetic material. In simpler terms, it's the digital form of genetic information which is found in DNA, RNA, or other genetic resources. And this information can be used for various scientific and biotechnological applications, such as research on biodiversity and conservation, development of new medicines and therapies, agricultural improvements, crop development, industrial biotechnology processes, and the likes. We also know that CBD and its Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization provide the international legal framework for access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. So, early deliberations on the increasing role of DSI in biotechnological research and development began at the 13th meeting of the Conference of Parties in 2016. And since then, the focus of the negotiations at the CBD have been on ensuring that benefits derived from the use of DSI are fairly and equitably shared. To this end, a decision was also made by the 15th meeting of the Conference of Parties in 2022 to establish a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing and to put into place a fair, transparent, inclusive, participatory, and time bound process to develop this mechanism. And after several discussions in the intersessionals, the Cali Fund has been launched as a global financial mechanism, which is part of a multilateral mechanism to support biodiversity conservation and ensure fair benefit sharing from the use of DSI. So, while the establishment of the fund has been called as a game changer, there are several questions that remain, including uh, no clarity on mechanisms for user contributions, certain legal uncertainties given to the fact that there are differing national policies. There is a risk of exemption of some users, and it could also potentially undermine benefit sharing regimes. Keeping in mind that these discussions are still going on and there is time to ensure that these are addressed. It also remains to be seen if the funds within the Cali Fund are actually transferred to Indigenous people and local communities as well as women, and what kind of mechanisms are adopted here on. So, our aim in this webinar was to address some of these issues, including what is the significance of the DSI decision and what is the path towards its operationalization. What is the relationship between the Cali Fund and the multilateral mechanism and the current national legislation and policy frameworks? And what is the potential of these decisions to benefit or affect the achievements of targets 22 and 23, with particular attention to the needs of indigenous peoples, local communities, and women and girls? So, to help us unpack some of these issues, we have a very esteemed panel of experts who have been engaging with these issues for quite some time. And I would first like to invite Mr. Ramakrishnan to take us through the history of the development of 𝗙SI in the CBD and Nagoya protocols, the significance of these decisions, and the next steps and concerns from the civil society perspective. Um, Nitin, I would like to invite you first, and I'll also like to introduce you. So, Nitin is a senior researcher at the Third World Network. He holds a postgraduate degree in international law and has been closely observing the WHO negotiations to amend the international health regulations and the new pandemic agreement. He is a civil society representative in the open ended working group for the enhancement of the multilateral system under the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And he represented Third World Network in the informal advisory group on benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources. Thank you so much, Nitin. And over to you now.
Uh, Thank you, Meenal. May I request permission to share my screen? Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Meenal, and respected other colleagues, Dr. Isabel and Dr. David and Ms. June Rubis. Um, I would try to present as short as possible a small history of negotiation and where we are traveling in terms of access and benefit sharing regimes in the world. So as I'm not going deep into any of these events, but just wanted to tell that COP16, COP15, COP13 decision 16 decided to consider the implications, potential implications of use of digital sequence information on genetic resources for the three objectives of the convention, which all of us know what are the three objectives. And when it came to COP 14, 2018, there was a decision to establish a science and policy based process on digital sequence information. And it also noted in COP 14 that when genetic resources are accessed for their utilization, mutually agreed terms can cover benefits arising from the commercial and non-commercial use of 𝗙SI on these genetic resources in accordance with applicable domestic measures. This was the decision in 2018. And I would argue that this science and policy based process, which has happened over a couple of last 6 to 8 years, had perhaps in a way kind of moved away the decisions or the discussions from the ideas of fairness, equity, and justice. It more focused on technical and scientific complexities, and technology development, etc., rather than focusing more on the need for equity and justice. COP15 in 2022 is where the parties agreed that the benefits from the use of 𝗙SI should be shared fairly and equitably. And then they decided the historic decision to establish a multilateral mechanism for securing benefit sharing from the use of 𝗙SI on genetic resources, including a global fund. So we have these years, but then I really want to go back and stress what has said in COP14 with regard to the capacity of the states to establish domestic measures in associate while sharing the genetic resources or while providing access to their genetic materials to decide what should happen with the 𝗙SI generated from those materials. COP16 decision, in that sense, is a reaffirmation of that noting which has happened in 2018. It actually recognizes the national sovereign rights over digital sequence information, especially to legislate upon them, right? Along with a decision of the operationalizing the global fund. And there are several other elements, and the decision in COP16 is only initial set of modalities. There will be additional set of modalities which will be adopted in COP17 or in the future COPs, coming COPs. So within this initial set of modalities, there are several elements. We don't have enough time to go into each of these elements, but the few important elements from our perspective is basically the recognition of national rights over DSI, especially to legislate. That's the first thing which comes to our mind. Second, what comes to our mind is the global fund known as Cali Fund, the establishment of multilateral, the operationalization of monetary facet of the multilateral mechanism. Then we also see, certain elements like how monetary sharing should come from users belonging to certain sectors. Those sectors are identified like pharmaceutical and agriculture and cosmetics, etc., etc. There is also discussions regarding non-monetary benefit sharing in addition to monetary benefit sharing. And then comes few other important concepts for us, which is the responsibility of databases and the parties hosting databases which share sequence information. And also it invites parties to use Cali Fund and multilateral mechanism. Now, the fund allocation from the mechanism happens through direct allocation to parties. Parties collect funds nationally or even through global fund, and then the parties decides on further distribution, and project funding or application by, I think, non-state actors come at this stage. There is also an establishment of steering committee to look into the various aspects of the operationalization of multilateral mechanism, including the what you call as the global fund. Now, that's what, so I'm just picking up three important paragraphs from COP16 decision, which we consider as the most key outcome, that it is from noting national rights to an invitation to exercise rights, right? In 2018, we noted that the governments and the states have the rights to establish conditions and seek benefits from the use of DSI. Now it is inviting the parties to take administrative policy and legislative measures to realize these benefit sharing aspects. Also kind of, not only to just on the conditions of benefit sharing, but also to kind of ensure that the intermediaries like databases do not frustrate the transactions relating to access and benefit sharing. I just want to, again, I'm not going into deep into the scope of multilateral mechanism because it can become quite technical, but I just wanted to show here also, this very clearly recognizes that without prejudice to national legislations. And we cannot complain the Convention on Biological Diversity or the COP regarding this, especially because what has developed is a non-binding, what you call as a resolution or decision stuff, right? Like a soft law instrument in a way. And in that, it is very difficult for any international organization or association of parties or coming together of states to take away national rights. So essentially, it has to agree that without prejudice to national legislation, this multilateral mechanism operates. Now, there are several other things to be decided, like the additional modalities and who will share how much money to the database, or how the non-monetary benefits sharing will happen, etc., etc. There are several things to be discussed, actors to be formed, ideas to be submitted and discussed at subsidiary body of implementation, etc. And several things like that. Now, the last question which was asked me to address is regarding what is our concerns regarding environmental and social justice. These are our concerns, some of the concerns. So we see certain lobbies are spreading a false narrative about the governability of data, which is significantly a problematic issue for us. We have seen in UNTAD several reports coming regarding how data is to be used and how that has to be governed to ensure equitable justice between developing and developed countries. And another one of the major reasons ABS was developed was to ensure regulation and oversight rather than monetary benefit sharing. So, we would argue the original drafters of developing countries were very well aware of the danger that benefit sharing becoming a financialization of genetic resources. To counter this, the original ABS framework was based on sovereign and IBLC's rights, right? So if a multilateral mechanism starts only focusing on only monetary contributions, then it's nothing but financialization of genetic resources. It has to focus on appropriate access, which is also a very significant, important objective recognized under Convention on Biological Diversity. Then if you have an idea that anyone can share DSI anonymously to whomever they want, and anybody can use that information for any purpose whatsoever, so long as they make a charity donation to the Global Fund, it is also nothing but financialization of genetic resources. So these are big real concerns for civil societies. So binding commitments for monetary and non-monetary benefit sharing has to happen, especially like something which is called as access to medicines, kind of very important non-monetary benefits. This has to become part of data use agreements in many of these databases. Otherwise, it's a traverse, it's a problem of justice. I just want to show what I was arguing, that Article 15 of the CBD very clearly says that access to genetic resources should be for environmentally sound uses, right? So there is this important element of regulation, monitoring, and oversight while providing access, and that needs to be developed further when it comes to the DSI multilateral mechanism. Objective 1 also talks about appropriate access to genetic resources. And I want to show another concern. So my first concern is that a deregulated multilateral mechanism would be against the principles of Article 15. The second concern would be the idea of a non-binding benefit sharing measures could significantly compromise non-monetary benefit sharing. You might think that companies can actually come forward and put money into the Global Fund, but that does not allow us to actually secure several other benefits which have come to us. Access to medicines is significant concern in this regard. This is a significant concern for women caucus as well, because if you see the two photographs, I mean, the pictures I've put it in the slide, this talks about plant-based anti-cancer compounds focused on breast cancer, cervical cancer, and ovarian cancers, right? And the value of these medicines are so high, and having a proper ABS measures can actually ensure equitable access to these medicines very soon. If you see the background report, which is from IPBS, let's say 70% of drugs for cancer are natural or inspired by nature. So this is where we see the importance of access to uh, genetic resources as well as DSI, and as equally important, fair and equitable sharing of benefits, especially non-monetary benefits. And this can happen only if you know who is making what, who is researching what, who is developing what, and only if you make them contractually obligated to ensure fair and equitable access to these products in vulnerable sections of the community. So it's a very, very important aspect. The final concern is that if you have a unregulated DSI sharing system, you cannot even ensure access to researchers around the globe without discrimination. Recently, GenBank, which is one of the INSDC data bank, right? Not GenBank, sorry, data banks from NIH, which is managing GenBank. China has been barred. In China and I think Cuba, as well as a few other countries, Iran, Venezuela were all barred at the time when Trump came in. And it's not just Trump. Previously, Joe Biden has also did some of this kind of barring of researchers from different countries to these resources. So it's also becoming a big issue. And I'm moving to the last slide. What are the questions before us? As women caucus, as civil society, what are the things before us? So whether we want legal certainty and guarantee for benefit sharing from the use of DSI. If yes, what are the questions we need to address? So we see now in the agreement, parties are invited to do it, right? The CBD decision 16.2 does not create a binding mechanism, but it invites parties to use legislative and administrative measures to make it binding, right? So we need to make it binding, and what could we do? But we must keep in mind, for the last 8 years, our countries were stopped from putting DSI regulation in mutually agreed terms. Now, what stopped them from legislating for last 8 years? Whether they were lacking capacities or whether they are under pressure from certain lobbies. I'm not naming anybody specifically. The question before us is whether we will encourage or discourage countries to build national capacities and legislations, including to use MLM, right? It's not that multilateral mechanism should be the only system, right? But it has to be a very important system which helps developing countries and countries lacking in capacities to use it and move forward and secure both monetary and non-monetary benefits. How much of our communities are willing to take control of our resources and data? It's also very, very important. We should not lay down our data and our genetic resources in a public domain, like whoever can just use it without identifying themselves or without recognizing who is providing the sources for them. So can we build monitoring and vigilance systems, and can we actually seek better transparency, participation, and benefits? I stop here. I hope I was on time.
Thank you so much, Nitin. You were well in time. And I would just like to thank you for explaining the decisions more clearly and also laying down what is going to happen throughout the year. And to also highlight some of the concerns that you shared, right, including data sharing, the importance of non-monetary benefits, how we need to ensure that fair and equitable access, along with our governments, we also need to ensure that fair and equitable access is upheld. And also, thank you for highlighting the clear asks and cautions that we need to look at as we move forward. So, thank you so much, Nitin. And I hope that you will have more questions from the audience, which you can answer. We'll now move on to our next panelist. Mr. David Eduardo Castro Garo is the director of the Directorate of Genetic Resources and Biodiversity in the Ministry of Environment for the Government of Peru. He is a biologist who specializes in biotechnology and biosafety. He has developed guidelines, regulations, and protocols for the safe use of genetically modified organisms. He is also an access and benefit sharing expert. And apart from this, he is also the founding member of the Peruvian Association for Journalists and Science Communicators. So he shall be sharing with us how these decisions on DSI relate to Peru's national laws and regulations. So thank you so much, Mr. David, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Minal. I'm going to give my presentation for better clarity. Eh, Gracias a los organizadores. Voy a hablar un poco de cuáles son los retos que plantea la decisión 16.2 sobre DSI en el contexto peruano. Nosotros contamos con un marco legal respecto al acceso a los recursos genéticos. El Perú es parte del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica, también es parte del Tratado Internacional de los Recursos Fitogenéticos para la Alimentación y la Agricultura. También somos parte del Protocolo de Nagoya, pero la regulación del acceso a los recursos genéticos en el país originalmente se basó en la decisión 391 de la Comunidad Andina de Naciones, ¿no? Perú, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, compartimos cierto tipo de legislación armonizada entre nuestros países, y una de ellas es el tema de el acceso a los recursos genéticos. Sobre la base de esta decisión de la Comunidad Andina, aprobamos en el año 2009 un primer reglamento de acceso a los recursos genéticos, el cual fue actualizado en el año 2021 para hacerlo mucho más operativo. Asimismo, tenemos una ley específica que regula todo el tema de los conocimientos tradicionales, y parte de los recursos genéticos está asociado a conocimientos tradicionales. Por lo tanto, como pueden ver, la legislación que tenemos en el país de alguna manera contempla tanto los tratados internacionales como las normas nacionales asociadas a los recursos genéticos. Y todo esto se basa en el consentimiento informado previo y en las condiciones mutuamente acordadas. Sin embargo, en el Perú tenemos una cierta complejidad para implementar las autorizaciones o los contratos de acceso a los recursos genéticos, porque Contamos con varias autoridades competentes que regulan el acceso en diferentes espacios, en diferentes ámbitos. Tenemos al Servicio Nacional Forestal y de Fauna Silvestre, que ve todo el tema de los recursos genéticos asociados a flora y fauna silvestre, también a los microorganismos asociados, pero fuera de las áreas naturales protegidas. Los recursos genéticos de flora y fauna silvestre que están dentro de áreas naturales protegidas, la autoridad competente es el Servicio Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas por el Estado. Para los recursos genéticos agrícolas, tenemos al Instituto Nacional de Innovación Agraria, cuya competencia también abarca dentro de las protegidas. Mientras que para todos los recursos hidrobiológicos tenemos al Ministerio de la Producción, cuyo ámbito de aplicación también incluye las áreas naturales protegidas. Entonces, este, mm, esta institucionalidad que tenemos en el acceso a recursos genéticos de alguna manera le genera cierta dificultad a los usuarios cuando soliciten sus autorizaciones o sus contratos de acceso a los recursos genéticos, ya sea sin fines comerciales, autorizaciones o con fines comerciales, contratos. El Ministerio del Ambiente, el cual yo represento, somos el ente de emitir, digamos, todos los lineamientos, las disposiciones, las regulaciones intersectoriales en materia de acceso a recursos genéticos y también focal del protocolo de Nagoya. Asimismo, el Perú, implementando el Marco Mundial de Biodiversidad a través de la Estrategia Nacional de Diversidad Biológica, nosotros contamos con dos metas específicas relacionadas con el acceso a los recursos genéticos y la distribución justa y equitativa de los beneficios. Nosotros buscamos al año 2030 incrementar en 20% las autorizaciones y contratos de acceso a los recursos genéticos y sus derivados, así como el 50% de estos contratos que cumplan de manera efectiva con la distribución de los beneficios monetarios y no monetarios. Ya un poco aterrizando a la decisión 16.2 de 𝗀𝗍𝗋, en el Perú, dentro de nuestro marco legal vigente, que es este decreto supremo del año 2021, consideramos también a la información digital de secuencias. Para nosotros, los recursos genéticos no solamente es el material físico, sino también la información genética. Y la información genética también incluye las secuencias que están almacenadas o están generadas digitalmente. O sea, se encuentran en base de datos públicas, por ejemplo. Entonces, nuestra legislación ya considera su ámbito de aplicación tema de 𝗀𝗍𝗋. Entonces, el reto que actualmente tenemos, porque de alguna manera la decisión de 𝗀𝗍𝗋 del CBD, eh, digamos, de alguna manera respeta o toma en consideración las legislaciones nacionales. Sin embargo, nosotros tenemos un reto aquí porque necesitamos capacidades técnicas y procedimientos específicos para regular el acceso a las secuencias digitales, que es muy distinto a regular el acceso al material genético físico, como lo hemos estado realizando hasta la fecha. También otro reto que nos plantea la decisión 16.2 es que de alguna manera se le da o se le transfiere la responsabilidad a las partes de que las contribuciones que deben dar las empresas al Fondo de Cali sean obligatorias. Si bien es cierto, el convenio no puede exigir o poner obligaciones a los entes privados, solamente a las partes, no son las partes quienes deben garantizar que estas empresas contribuyan con el Fondo de Cali. Entonces el problema viene aquí. ¿Por qué? Porque los países deben adecuar sus legislaciones nacionales para no solamente incentivar a que los usuarios de DCI, especialmente los que obtienen beneficios monetarios, contribuyan al fondo. ¿Por qué? Porque tenemos que ver cuál va a ser el mecanismo por el cual se garantice estas contribuciones al fondo. Puede ser a través de algún tipo de impuesto, pero eso requiere necesariamente en el país incluso una discusión a nivel de económico, que es muy complicado. Muchos países no están, digamos, muy a favor o ven con buenos ojos establecer ciertos impuestos al uso de los recursos naturales, ver algún tipo de regalía. Entonces, el mecanismo, cómo garantizar estas contribuciones va a ser bastante complicado en muchos países, especialmente en países en vías de desarrollo, donde el nivel de informalidad también es bastante elevado. También hay que considerar la gran diferencia que hay entre los países del norte global y del sur global, ¿no? Los países como el Perú, países de México, Brasil, Colombia, entre otros, somos países altamente diversos, ¿no? Pero también tenemos ciertas limitaciones en cuanto al nivel tecnológico y de recursos humanos. También la inversión en investigación de desarrollo es bastante limitada. Y esto nos pone una seria desventaja contra los países desarrollados, quienes usan, digamos, los recursos genéticos y toda la información genética que se genera de esta parte del continente, ¿no? De los países en vías de desarrollo y países megadiversos, generando una gran brecha que hasta la fecha no ha podido ser cubierta. La decisión 16 esta brecha y de alguna manera lo va a utilizar como un factor de ponderación al momento de asignar los fondos a los países. Otra cuestión que nos parece muy importante es que por fin las bases de datos exijan cierto tipo de información a los que depositen secuencias en sus repositorios y a los que accedan a sus repositorios, ¿no? Los que accedan van a tener información de que deben cumplir con las legislaciones nacionales, que pueden estar sujetos a distribución de beneficios monetarios y no monetarios, pero también va a haber un cierto grado de exigencia para que se reconozca el país de origen del recurso o la información genética que está siendo depositada, ¿no? Están considerados también los principios de fair care y que los usuarios o los que vayan a depositar secuencias informen si es que tienen algún tipo de restricción de compartir esa secuencia a nivel público. Sin embargo, el reto para países como nosotros es que tenemos que desarrollar capacidades para gestionar esta información genética que se genera sobre la base de nuestros recursos genéticos, pero que muchas veces no podemos aprovechar nosotros. Y la parte más complicada siempre es rastrear y regular su utilización. Tal como mencionó Nathan, no hay un cierto tipo de seguimiento a quienes acceden y quienes hacen uso de estas secuencias genéticas depositadas en las bases de datos públicas, ¿no? La base para que se garantice una contribución adecuada al fondo de Cali y no sea un fondo más que no tenga recursos para ser utilizados en pro de la conservación de la biodiversidad. Y finalmente, el reto que tenemos es cómo implementar un sistema adecuado en el país para captar estos fondos. Algo positivo que tiene la decisión de los fondos del mecanismo multilateral van a ser asignados directamente a las partes, ya no a través de proyectos como son otros fondos y que de alguna manera podrían ser injustos porque había que concursar y eso dependía mucho del interés de la entidad que administra estos, de la misma COP, ¿no? Y la misma COP muchas veces los intereses a veces de países influyen más que de los países en desarrollo porque son ellos quienes dan las mayores donaciones a, a estos fondos como el GEF, por ejemplo. Entonces, la asignación directa a las partes nos parece mucho más justa porque cada país ya va a definir cuáles son sus prioridades para hacer uso de estos fondos. Sin embargo, tenemos que ver cuál va a ser el mecanismo para captar estos fondos. En el Perú al menos no contamos con un Fondo Nacional de Biodiversidad, que sería lo ideal para hacerlo. Y se ingresa directamente a las entidades del gobierno, muchas veces este dinero cae en el presupuesto público de la nación y de alguna manera ya se pierde la trazabilidad y no se destina finalmente al objetivo que debe ser la conservación de la biodiversidad. Entonces puede buscar de repente alguna organización, algún ente cooperante, pero obviamente ellos también cobran un porcentaje por gastos administrativos, por los gastos de la gestión de los fondos. Entonces también para nosotros va a ser un reto ver la forma como captamos y utilizamos adecuadamente esos fondos, porque hay que considerar también que más de la mitad debe ser destinado también a cubrir las necesidades y prioridades de las organizaciones indígenas y comunidades locales. ¿No? Esto quería presentarles hoy. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Mr. David, for sharing some of the complexities for parties of the global south when it is coming to regulating access, especially to, even though the physical genetic resources have some means of regulating access, DSI presents a whole different ballgame. How difficult it is to track users, how to make sure that users are contributing to these mechanisms, and also the gap that it creates between the countries of the global now north and the south on who regulates and who provides access. So, thank you so much for allowing us to see this through the eyes of parties as well. And it just gives us food for thought as to what are what are some of the challenges that we may need to address as we move ahead with the multilateral mechanism being designed. So with that, I'm also excited to introduce our next speaker. Welcome, Dr. 𝗙cie𝗶𝗹𝗶. Dr. 𝗙cie𝗶𝗶𝗹 is a Sweden-based legal policy, strategy, engagement, and trends advisor on biodiversity, access and benefit sharing, and sustainability with international industry experience. She holds a PhD in international and European law from Ghent University in Belgium, and she has taught courses on biodiversity and access and benefit sharing laws in several European universities. She is also the founder and principal consultant at 𝗙BIS, where she provides legal and policy advice to governments, research institutions, and industry. She also holds active roles in international decision making and trend setting bodies such as 𝗙PES and IUCN. And she will examine how existing access and benefit sharing mechanisms under the Nagoya Protocol are specifically addressing the needs of women and girls, and the opportunities and challenges presented by the DSI decision and the Cali Fund for women and girls in biodiversity conservation. I'll hand it over to you, Dr. 𝗙cie𝗶𝗶𝗹.
Thank you, Minal. Good morning, good afternoon from my side, and good evening, everyone. My personal interests within the ABS world are areas that we can improve and areas that we know and discuss less about. Since I'm both a practitioner and an academic working on ABS, I enjoy looking into practical gaps from the academic lens, and the topic of DSI and gender happens to be one of them. And before I move on to the nitty-gritty details of all of the documents and frameworks we have, I actually want to talk about the idea of gender in the world of DSI and what kind of areas we would like to look at. With any newly generated technology, we face the need to balance fast and informed decision-making on the application of this technology, the implications of these technologies, global impacts these technologies have, and the governance of these technologies. And technologies such as DSI, these disruptive technologies, and when I mean disruptive, I mean technologies that create new systems or change the systems that we currently operate under. And DSI definitely does that. How does it do that? Today, when you look at biodiversity conservation and biodiversity research and monitoring projects, be it academic ones or international ones, multinational ones, DSI is the #1 tool to go to for researchers, for scientists. Same goes for utilization. We start from looking into databases for data, generating data, adding to databases. That's how research and development start when it comes to biodiversity today. So DSI definitely has been a disruptive technology. And any innovation, disruptive innovation with global impact, bears the potential of both the intended and unintended consequences. Any new technology both creates a new system of applications and integrates itself to existing systems. And because of this, it is important to look at the implications of a new technology from a more holistic, more systems thinking perspective. And systems thinking is not very foreign to the world of CBD, because it is also an integral part of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, as this framework is built around the theory of change, and this theory of change of this framework stresses the need for an urgent policy action through a whole-of-society approach. And the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is guided by the interconnectedness of ecological, economic, and social dimensions of biodiversity. The interconnected approach here is to guide us to our goal of living in harmony with nature by 2050 and achieving the 3 objectives of the CBD. And throughout these negotiations, the parties have acknowledged that the DSI has the potential to meet these 3 objectives, which are conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of its components, and fair and equitable sharing of benefits. They have also acknowledged time and again the contributions of women to the conservation of biodiversity through the actual text of the CBD, through the Nagoya Protocol, and through many, many COP decisions. And the landmark decision 15/9 on DSI specifically underlined the capacity, needs, and priorities of women. DSI enables us to see the biology of the world through data. So when looking into the issue of DSI and gender, I also want to look into the data regarding gender and see what is available for us. I want to understand the governance of our world through data, because data is what is popular today. And I'll be talking about areas in which we as a global society have improved over the past decades, but are still facing challenges, and link them with DSI governance. And these areas are participation in decision-making, utilization of DSI, conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and benefit sharing. So let's start with data on women in policy and decision-making. According to recent data from UN Women, today only 10% of the heads of state are women. And today women only hold 22.8% of the ministerial positions around the world. While this number seems to be slightly more effective, more higher on the ministerial positions for the environment at 32%, public administration at 30%, and education at 30%, men dominantly hold positions in ministries such as economy, defense, and justice. According to a recent World Bank report, women today enjoy less than 2/3 of rights available to men. And while participation and legal rights are far more secure in OECD high-income countries, due to many planned actions and policy reforms, there still exists a large room for improvement. So statistically, less than 1/3 of policy and decision-making are done by women, and women do not enjoy as many rights as men can today. Now, let's look at women in science and innovation, because if DSI is to be utilized and made use of by women, they should be holding positions in these sectors. And women have increased their representation in science over the last decades, but there still exists a critical gap for women in science. According to data from UNESCO, approximately 1 in 3 of the researchers are women. According to academic studies, these numbers affect the number of scientific publications by women, level of seniority in scientific posts held by women, as well as the research funding received by women. According to recent data from WIPO, women inventors are behind only 23% of global patent applications. When it comes to biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, these are 2 fields where women investors are behind 30% of all patent applications. So here we see the trend that existed in the policy and decision-making field also present in science and innovation field, 1/3 or less. Now let's look at women in biodiversity conservation, sustainable use and benefit sharing. Here, women are particularly underrepresented. According to scientific literature, this is because the structural dependencies around conservation and natural resource management prevent women from participating in decision-making. Even though scientific literature acknowledges the importance of integrating gender-responsive actions into conservation and management of natural resources. Many studies show that more equitable representation of women lead to more equitable benefit sharing and improved conservation outcomes. And some studies link this to the fact that women have been found to spend more time in managing natural resources. But women tend to lack participation in decision-making in these fields as well, due to the lack of acknowledgement of their roles, the lack of access to information, reduced access to education, and lack of access to land ownership and tenure. Women in conservation careers, so it's not just women dealing with natural resource management, but women in conservation careers are also affected by several structural dependencies and biases. Research shows that women tend to be hired for more administrative tasks rather than roles for which men are preferred, such as leadership, risk-taking, and fieldwork. So what do we do with this data? And now we can have a look at what the frameworks we're operating under tell us when it comes to gender responsiveness, gender equity, and 𝗙cie. And by these frameworks, I mean the CBD, the Nagoya Protocol, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and the relevant COP decisions, as well as the terms of reference of the Cali Fund and the role of the ad hoc technical expert group on allocation methodology. And there are countless references to the importance of the role of women in biodiversity conservation within the CBD, starting from all the way in Agenda 21 in 1992, 8J provisions, and Gender Plan of Action. We know that gender responsiveness is really crucial for CBD. And likewise, the Target 23 and Section C of the KMGBF, these ask us to take all targets as a whole and integrate gender responsiveness into every single one of them. And this is what is needed, this holistic approach is what is needed for the successful implementation. And when we turn to the Nagoya Protocol, here again, the preamble acknowledges the vital role women play in ABS. It also emphasizes the importance of full participation of women at all levels of policymaking and implementation of biodiversity conservation. Then the same goes for Article 22 of the protocol, strongly emphasizing on the capacity needs and priorities of women and enhancing the capacity of women within Indigenous and local communities. That's the wording of the protocol. Then in COP decision 16/2, the latest COP decision on 𝗙cie, we see acknowledgement of women and youth within Indigenous peoples and local communities in terms of allocation and mobilization of funds, as well as respect for their rights. Then we look at the terms of reference of the Cali Fund, and we see that the ad hoc technical expert group develops the allocation formula based on the criteria mentioned in 16/2, which will then be presented to COP17. However, between now and COP17, the steering committee is to determine the formula based on the same criteria. Now, again comes the question, what can we do? What can we do with all this information, all this data, and all the frameworks that we have? The global policy and decision-making currently prioritizes data. And 𝗙cie is valued for its ability to generate data out of our biological world. We refer to data when we want to emphasize on a certain policy or capacity need. The world does not just comprise of data, I'm well aware of that, but the reality of today's trend is data. And what we need more of is gender disaggregated data. Gender disaggregated data make women visible and make us see to what extent women are part of the operationalization of 𝗙cie, to what extent they work with 𝗙cie, to what extent they benefit from the generation and use of 𝗙cie. And Target 23 indicators are looking for gender disaggregated data. If we're talking about 𝗙cie and gender, then we need to know what 𝗙cie means for gender in terms of data. And we do have some data. I mean, in the beginning of my talk, I presented you with the 1/3 or less dilemma. And we need gender-responsive policies that tackle these numbers. We need policies that involve the perspectives of both men and women in a systematic manner. And we also need effective capacity building for women to participate in decision-making, science and innovation, as well as have the ability to become effective beneficiaries of benefit sharing. We need gender-sensitive capacity building in 𝗙cie. And lastly, we need collaboration amongst everyone, the governments, NGOs, indigenous peoples and local communities, scientific institutions and industry to enhance gender responsiveness. Only with that whole of society approach that we have in the global biodiversity framework can we alleviate root causes. Well, it is important for the steering committee as well as the 𝗙TEG to be mindful of these needs of women, and while determining the allocation formula, we know that this is not necessarily a silver bullet solution. Systemic shifts require a whole of society approach. This is what is requested from the achievement of the GBF. While the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol both acknowledge time and again the importance of women for conservation and benefit sharing, it is our responsibility, everyone's responsibility, to bring these words to life. I'd like to conclude my talk with the following quote from UN Women. Gender inequality affects everyone, in particular women and girls. And I'd like to also add that gender inequality affects anyone, anywhere. We are in a very interconnected world. The policies of one country affect many others. The economic decisions of one country affect many others. We're living in a biosphere, and the decisions of a country on our living world and our people affect all of us. And women are strong, powerful, and resilient. What we need is our systems to acknowledge this and ensure women are able to participate in their creation. It's not just about inclusion, but empowerment to co-design these systems together. After all, biodiversity is about diversity of life on Earth, and that includes all of us. Much of what I talked about today has been previously published as a policy brief with the support of the Norwegian Agency for Development and Cooperation, and I'm happy to share the study with the participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, 𝗙cie𝗶𝗶, for highlighting that we already have the international frameworks in place, but from now on to COP17, we do need to ensure that there is more gender disaggregated data, and that there is a need to deeply engage with how the Cali Fund as well as the multilateral mechanism ensures that some of the needs already identified for women and girls are taken into consideration. So thank you so much for really helping us understand why it is important, because we do live in a data in a world that values data. So we will share the policy brief that 𝗙cie𝗋𝗋 spoke about. But moving on, we have very little time left. So I'm honored to introduce our last speaker for the webinar, Dr. June Rubis. June began her career as a conservation biologist and has 12 years in hands-on wildlife conservation fieldwork in both the Indonesian and the Malaysian Borneo. Her PhD research examined a decolonial indigenous approach to orangutan conservation in the Sarawak. She is also the Global Council co-chair for documenting territories of life for the 𝗙cie𝗋𝗋 consortium and is the co-founder of Building Initiatives in Indigenous Heritage, which is a social enterprise. She is also an observer on the steering committee for the multilateral mechanism for the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of TSI, where she will represent Indigenous peoples and local communities from Asia. So she will be talking to us about the significance of DSI and the Cali Fund for Indigenous people and local communities, and also some of the concerns that we need to take into consideration when it comes to access and benefit sharing and Indigenous people and local communities. The floor is yours, June.
Thank you so much, Mina, and hello, everyone. Before I begin, let me see if I could share right now. I also just want to acknowledge the tireless advocacy and hard work of the IAFB, Indigenous and Local Communities Caucus. If it wasn't for their work, for the work, the tireless long work, and also advocacy by Indigenous peoples in different international forums, we won't be here where we are today. So I wanted to speak, and I think first I would like to start with setting the context of why this is so important as well, to consider Indigenous peoples and local communities. I mean, I wanted to say, as much as yes, data is very important and really vital, data is also not neutral. It's a resource that is embedded in power dynamics, control, and commodification. So for Indigenous peoples and local communities, biocultural knowledge is a living heritage that is inherently connected to land, identity, and community governance. So when this knowledge is abstracted into DSI, it risks being stripped of its cultural significance and repackaged as mere data. And it's a commodified asset that is accessible to corporations and research institutions without adequate Indigenous peoples and local communities' consent and compensation. Also, I wanted to say, and I completely forgot, I want to acknowledge there are people from IAFB and from the DSI group I saw in the audience today, and I just want to acknowledge them. Edith Yolanda Turan, who also sits with me on the Cali Fund Steering Committee, is also here. Rodrigo and Jasmine, they're our DSI experts. So I just want to acknowledge and call them out, because it was, if not for them, I mean, this presentation could not be, done, but all mistakes are mine, by the way. So why, when we think about DSI frameworks, about the risk of transforming biocultural knowledge into mere data sets detached from their context? I mean, often, as we heard from our speakers today, DSI frameworks often prioritize data accessibility and interoperability, aligning with FAIR principles, for example, but they do not adequately consider the cultural context from which data is derived. So, I mean, the concern is when digital extraction of bicultural knowledge is effectively decoupled from its source community and transformed into data sets that could be shared, modified, and monetized without regard for Indigenous peoples and local communities' governance. So, for example, we can think of medicinal plant data sourced from Indigenous territories that are sequenced, digitized, and uploaded into global databases where it can be accessed and commercialized without acknowledging the community's traditional knowledge or seeking their consent. So this connection that perpetuates extractive data, upholding data into a pedestal, it mirrors actually colonial land and resource extraction, but in digital form. I was going to say next slide, please, and then I realized that's my work. How do I do next slide? Here we go. So I want to talk about expanding what we mean about data sovereignty in the context of this DSI. Nitin, thank you so much for talking about the without prejudice to national legislation. And this was also due to India's interventions. So as a result, the phrase "without prejudice to national legislation," it reinforces countries' rights to manage DSI under their own access and benefit sharing frameworks. So all DSI users must share benefits arising from use, but this only applies under specific conditions, such as when the data is made publicly available, or it's not subject to mutually agreed terms, and it's not already covered by other international agreements. So I want to talk a bit as well about the lineage-based claims. So the lineage-based claims attempts to link genetic data back to specific ancestral lineages and populations, positioning this as rightful stakeholders in benefit sharing agreements. However, this approach was not incorporated into the DSI framework due to several challenges. Data abstraction. So when genetic data is digitized and sequenced, it becomes abstracted from its original biological context, making it difficult to trace lineage accurately. There's scientific resistance. Researchers and biotech companies argue that DSI is not directly tied to physical genetic resources, thus contesting lineage claims. And policy fragmentation. So where national ABS frameworks vary widely and there's no global mechanism to enforce lineage-based claims, which creates inconsistencies in recognition and enforcement. So now the current focus is on territory and genetic resources. So since lineage-based claims are sidelined, how can we anchor protecting data that is explicitly generated in territories and in genetic resources themselves? We can think of asserting the rights of Indigenous peoples to maintain control over cultural heritage, knowledge, and genetic resources, which should also extend to DSI. So this would be the UNDRIP. Anchoring in the 𝗀cie Protocol, so establishing rules for ABS linked to physical genetic resources. However, it remains limited in scope for genetic sequences, which creates a regulatory gap, and national ABS frameworks. So as we heard from an example of Peru, countries are attempting to fill this gap by instituting their own ABS laws. But in many cases, enforcement can be inconsistent and often exclude digital data. And there's vulnerability of DSI for misappropriation. So when we abstract genetic data into digital formats, it creates a significant vulnerability once data is digitized and circulated. So it's no longer attached to its point of origin. So this enables several risks: decoupling from territory, which means digital data can be used, altered, and patented without the involvement of the source community or territory, bypassing consent protocols. Fragmented benefit sharing. While genetic resources are protected under the ABS agreements, DSI often falls into the legal gray area, allowing corporations to extract value without providing adequate compensation and recognition. Data mining and monetization. Companies can aggregate and monetize genetic data as DSI, creating commercial products or intellectual property without engaging with or compensating the knowledge holders. So, I mean, there are many implications for our Indigenous peoples and local communities, including knowledge extraction, a lack of recourse without explicit legal recognition. IPs and LCs have limited avenues to contest unauthorized use or demand benefit sharing, and also missed opportunities. Oh, here it is. Yes, so knowledge extraction, lack of resource, and missed opportunities for economic sovereignty. So potential revenue streams from bicultural data remain unrealized for Indigenous peoples and local communities, while multinational companies profit from biotech advancements derived from DSI. So there are various implications for IPs and LCs to consider. So the DSI decision in the last 15th meeting was significant because it recognizes the significant and important role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in biodiversity conservation. So now we sit, sorry?
Sorry, can you slow down a bit? It's difficult for the interpreters.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry about this, yeah.
Okay. So the significance of the DSI decision means that for Indigenous peoples and local communities, now that we sit hand in hand with parties in regards of governance decisions, and that is really pivotal. And as well, for the 16th meeting, the operational guidelines of how Cali Fund would work were adopted. So now, as mentioned, we now have the Cali Fund as a financial mechanism to operationalize the benefit sharing framework under the multilateral mechanism. So this is what it would look like for the contribute criteria. As you can see, entities with assets over $20 million or sales exceeding $50 million or profits over $5 million, they're expected to contribute either 1% of profits or 0.1% of revenue. And they've identified the sectors as well. I think as what's important to note, it's not just benefit sharing as in profits, but also non-monetary benefit sharing. So that means capacity building, data governance training for IPs and LCs to manage and protect DSI and knowledge exchange. And at least half of the funds, 50%, must be allocated for IP and LCs either through direct payments or through institutions identified by IPs and LCs to support capacity building, conservation, and sustainable use initiatives. And the next meetings for the COP17 and 18, they will continue to talk about the thresholds and contributions, whether they should be reassessed, and of course the allocation formula. So the ATEC, the technical group, will be facilitating how the allocation would work in regards of the funds distribution and what would compliance and enforcement would be like. So these are the substantive actions required to implement Cali Fund. So for the users of DSI, they have to share benefits arising from the use of DSI in a fair and equitable manner. Database operators, they have to ensure that the info is made publicly available in a transparent and accountable manner. For parties and governments, they have to implement policy or legislative measurements to incentivize entities to contribute to the Cali Fund. And for developing country parties in particular, they should designate or establish national entities to receive and distribute funds and report on their use. Now, the Cali Fund is implemented by the Multi-Partner Trust Fund, which is the UN agencies who are also part of the Cali Fund Steering Committee. So yes, as mentioned, there's a Cali Fund Steering Committee right now with 15 members nominated by parties, 3 from each region, 7 members from IPs and LCs representing each social cultural region, and 2 members from the UN entities. And of course, observers from civil society, scientific institutions, and private sector. So the mandate of the Cali Fund Steering Committee is to provide an oversight to ensure that the Cali Fund disperses funds according to established modalities, to help guide the operations of the Secretariat and report and provide advice, and to develop a draft methodology for reviewing the effectiveness of the multilateral mechanism. So the Cali Fund Steering Committee should be working really closely with the ECTEC, the technical expert group as well. So what are the further implications for IPs and LCs? As I mentioned, this is a new funding stream for biodiversity conservation and data sovereignty, where at least 50% hopefully will be direct access funding. But I saw a question on the chat on how could we ensure that 50% goes to IPs and LCs who could truly use the funds. There's opportunities where could we possibly see strategic alignment with national policies and existing frameworks? And also, can we reframe data as a biocultural asset rather than a cultural extraction? So bringing data back again to its territories, to its cultural meaning. Of course, there's many risks, the potential data misappropriation and cultural erosion when safeguards are not robust, when we rely as well, it's currently voluntary contributions, as Nitin has pointed out, it's not binding, and the absence of strong compliance mechanisms. So what happens when, the parties do not do, or the companies do not do what they're supposed to do? So the core components of the multilateral mechanism that are crucial to IP and LC needs is that, we hope to see more transparency and accountability in the data governance and allocation of benefits. Having us sit, side by side by parties in the Cali Fund, it's a huge, a huge opportunity, but we have to continue. It's just one step. We have to continue that more of us, more IPs and LCs are directly represented in decision-making processes in every aspect of all the DSI frameworks, from global, regional to national. Inclusion of bicultural protocols as a fundamental component, how I feel. And also, how can we protect data that is explicitly generated on territories and genetic resources themselves? And as I mentioned, we can anchor this under the UNDRIP, the 𝗀cie protocol, and national ABS frameworks that support IPs and LCs. So what are the key components to advocate for? So fair and equitable benefit sharing mechanisms. Can we co-develop data sharing agreements that recognize IP and LC's governance structures? Can we ensure transparency? We advocate for more transparency in data collection, usage, and benefit sharing. Emphasis on transparency and open data principles. We've heard already about the fair and care. There's also trust, which also very much aligns to Indigenous peoples and local communities, to assert control over how data is accessed and utilized globally. Nitin has also pointed out there should be binding agreements for benefit sharing, and as well, how can we publicly? I think we should publicly disclose how 50% of the allocation is calculated. So then there's transparency involved. Much of the advocacy work for Indigenous peoples are around a legal recognition of customary rights and knowledge systems. So again, using UNDRIP to assert the rights of Indigenous peoples to maintain control over cultural heritage, knowledge, and genetic resources, which should extend to DSI. Because I'm from the region of Southeast Asia, 𝗙𝗃𝗏 from the Philippines is a possible regional framework for integrating FPIC and data sovereignty in DSI governance. So it's something to consider, as well as bicultural data as protected form of cultural heritage. We should also insist upon capacity building and funding for IPs and LCs-led data governance initiatives. We need to support IPs and LCs in developing technical and legal capacity to track and manage genetic data as DSI. And of course, also focus on direct access funding so that we don't always rely on intermediaries. Monitoring and compliance systems that prioritize IP and LC's oversight are crucial, and this should include establishing a grievance mechanisms, I believe, to report for unauthorized use or misuse of data. And FPIC, free, prior, informed consent and digital data governance. So as the previous speaker has mentioned, the vital role of women in access and benefit sharing. There's a lot of knowledge that's also held within women for Indigenous peoples and local communities that are only women-centered. So when we think about FPIC, it's also the right to say no, so I think we should support and the rights of saying no, of sharing, and ensuring as well the full and effective participation. Again, how could we engage meaningfully? Having more of these discussions, possibly leading to data governance reforms. For example, aligning DSI governance with national ABS frameworks. As Niti pointed out, can we push for binding commitments to benefit sharing, IP and LC-centric protocols, and also who holds governance? I worry about IPs and LCs being tokenized in these spaces. So we have to make sure that the ability of IPs and LCs to influence key decisions, that they remain visible and strong and not just limited. We need stronger advocacy for direct control over data and funds. And of course, FPIC as a foundational principle, and recognizing as well the vital role of women within data governance. On the data sovereignty frameworks, we've heard about the fair, care, and trust principles. I was recently in Canberra for a conference that was held by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So they are mostly from Anglo countries such as New Zealand, Australia, and North America. Particularly in New Zealand, there's a lot of interesting work around data sovereignty. So I think there's lessons learned on how can we prevent misappropriation and ensure Indigenous controlled data storage. And of course, capacity building. IPs and LCs, we need further technical and legal capacity. How can we, ensure that our genetic data is, managed and tracked according to our bicultural protocols and, not misappropriated? And how and also continue supporting community protocols for DSI management. And I think that's it, a call to action for all of us to get involved and to recognize, again, to reiterate, data is not neutral, it's how we use data. And just thinking about the power dynamics. I liked what the previous speaker said about the whole society, and I think you can't have the whole society without Indigenous peoples and local communities really considered and working together and on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, June, for especially pointing out that data is also a biocultural asset for many communities, and we still don't have existing regulatory mechanisms where you spoke about lineage-based claims, and how a lot of these existing systems actually fall through the cracks when we try to develop control mechanisms over it. But thank you so much for addressing some of these concerns. And also to the other speakers, we have a huge task cut out before us, especially the members of the steering committee. And to ensure that some of these concerns that our panelists raised are actually addressed while some of these discussions are happening in the next 2 years. So we do have a few questions. I'm going to get into that right away. June did address one of the questions of how to ensure some of the ways in which the 50% benefits could be effectively shared with Indigenous people and local communities. So we have that. There was a question for Mr. David. What technological capabilities exist in Peru currently to track DSI use, and how can they be strengthened?
Gracias por la pregunta. Bueno, capacidades tecnológicas hoy en día para, para generar información digital de secuencias sí las hay, ¿no? No solamente en el país, sino fuera del país, a veces es mucho más económico enviar las muestras fuera para que las secuencien y ya aquí en el país se carga dentro de los repositorios específicos. El reto es cómo monitoreamos el acceso, el uso de esa información genética que está en estas bases de datos públicas. Todo lo que se requiere aquí es capacidades en programación, en bioinformática, para que se puedan generar alertas. Como son bases de datos públicas abiertas, puede, digamos, ser interoperable con ciertas herramientas bioinformáticas, tecnológicas que nos permitan generar alertas cuando haya algún tipo de carga o descarga de una información de alguna especie que sea nativa o endémica de un determinado país, por ejemplo, como el Perú, ¿no? Podemos tener una lista de especies nativas o prioritarias al menos, y que cada vez que se genere una secuencia sobre esa especie, genere una alerta que le llegue a un punto de verificación específico que habría que también implementar. ¿No? Entonces, las herramientas existen, la tecnología existe. Creo que aquí lo que falta es un poco más de proactividad por parte, digamos, de los que gestionan las bases de datos públicas. Ellos tienen todo el expertise. O en todo caso, que transfieran tecnología, presupuesto para que cada parte pueda implementarlo y hacer un monitoreo específico de las secuencias digitales que son originarias de sus territorios.
Thank you so much, Mr. David. There is one more question as a follow-up. How feasible will it be to have legal frameworks on DSI in the 𝗀𝗃 region?
Yo pienso que sí, al menos en esta parte del continente, en Sudamérica, eh, Brasil, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Perú, Contamos con cierto tipo de legislación, algunos de ellos más básicas que otros, otros mucho más avanzadas, pero es a nivel del acceso a los recursos genéticos, del material físico, ¿no? Entonces, al contar con esta base, es mucho más fácil, de alguna manera, extrapolarlo a la información genética. Entonces, hay negociaciones a nivel del Tratado de los Países Amazónicos, por ejemplo, para establecer algún tipo de régimen común que haga también, o que cubra también el uso de la información digital de secuencias. Países como Colombia y Perú, que ya tienen un sistema regulatorio y que considera la información genética, también estamos viendo mecanismos para implementar específicamente cómo gestionar esta información en el país. Entonces, sí hay, al menos en Latinoamérica, hay bastante experiencia en la gestión de los recursos genéticos que puede ser extrapolado a la información digital de secuencias.
Thank you so much, Mr. David. I can see that Nitin, you have raised your hand.
Thank you, Mina. Just intervention with regard to the first question regarding technological capacities. Just wanted to, no, I'm not talking specific to Peru, but on the other hand, just wanted to highlight a couple of things. Essentially, the Africa group has actually proposed during the working group meeting, I believe, to have a multilaterally governed database for sharing the new DSI, where it's not just only the DSI belonging to the scope of CBD. They had a proposal that the developing countries who lack capacities to manage their own national ABS systems or national databases should be provided with facilities to manage or platforms within the databases. I mean, that's a very interesting proposal. I just want to highlight to the last slide of my presentation, before the last slide of my presentation, where I said, currently we believe that existing databases are publicly available and guarantees open access. It's not true. It's actually owned by few governments, and their policies can shut access to different countries, to researchers from different countries. So we are living in a kind of illusion that there is a guarantee of open access, whereas it does not, right? So it's very important to establish truly multilaterally governed database mechanisms or frameworks. I don't know whether it requires a new database, or whether you can bring certain databases together and develop a framework which is accountable to all parties, right? And with regard to tracking use of DSI, I want to say there's a lot of range of measures, starting from basic user registration to setting up of what you call as AI based alerts, etc., right? So we don't have to use all these things, but essentially we should not work from a assumption that scientific community would like to work around, because I have seen around 290 scientists writing to WHO asking for an accountable database, right, in the context of pandemic agreement and pathogen access sharing, right? So we should not assume that scientific community do not want anonymous access, want ungoverned databases, etc. They also need an accountable database, which would be transparent to all parties, right? Thank you.
Thanks, Nitin, for a bit of clarity on that, on whether these databases are actually available to a lot of not just researchers, but also possibly to people from whom this data has been generated, which includes indigenous people and local communities. So that's one. Um, there is a repeated request for the panelists, if we can share the presentations that you have prepared. If it is okay with all the panelists, we could share them. But of course, if only if it's okay with y'all. Otherwise, just to tell everybody, this is also being live streamed on YouTube, so you can go on to our channel on YouTube, Women for Biodiversity, and this webinar will be available just in case you need to access any sort of information that was shared here. There is one remark that is open for any of the panelists to address. So, given the voluntary nature of the scheme, which I'm assuming is the Cali Fund, large companies who use DSI are saying that since clear rules do not exist, they will not have to undergo double sharing, which means I think for in the according to national laws and also according to the multilateral mechanism set up. So I would like to just clarify, is it so that most large companies will not have to do this? And if that is the case, then how do we move ahead? So anybody who can take that up from our panelists?
May I?
Sure, Nitin, go
Sorry,
ahead.
sorry. I just want to say it's actually a myth that companies will have to make double payments, right? Because the scope of the multilateral mechanism is very clearly delineated. It's there in the paragraph 1 of the annex, right? And whatever DSI belonging to the scope, or whatever use of DSI belonging to the scope of multilateral mechanism, if you use it, you have to pay to the global fund. If you use, or if your use of DSI belongs to some other jurisdiction, you have to pay the respective applicable fund or applicable benefit sharing mechanism. That's how the way works. I'm a social science researcher. I pay money to Oxford Library. I pay money to Cambridge Library. I pay money to different various databases for my resources in data. And why should companies get afraid of, if they're sourcing data from different countries or different collections or different jurisdictions, they will have to share benefits into each of them. That's on basis of their use, right? So it has, it's actually a myth that they will have to make dual payments based on the understanding of DS. The whole point of having this one paragraph, paragraph 1 of annex, was to avoid this idea of double payments. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitin. Unfortunately, we have just 3 minutes left, and our interpreters are also quite tired. But I would thank the panelists, first of all, for taking the short time that we had provided and really delving so much into details about this topic. It's a topic of great concern, great interest, given that some of the modalities are going to be discussed in the next couple of months, and also that there are so many different components to this, and we've tried to address some. We've had people looking at it from so many different angles who have become panelists today, but I'm sure that there will be more questions which we will pose to you as some of these modalities become more apparent. And this is a very deep question that has just come in. If somebody can write it in the chat, we can move ahead. Sumina, any last requests from you, from comms?
Yes, thank you, Mina. If everybody could open their camera so that I can take a picture, a virtual picture, that would be nice. Okay, thank you. On the count of 3, if everybody could smile for me. Okay, 1, 2, and just one more. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much also to our collaborators, Third World Network and the Ministry of Environment, Peru, and to our panelists. And we will try and make sure that the presentations are available either on our website or on our YouTube channel, where you can access them. And this was also live streamed, so you can go back to our YouTube channel and also see this webinar. Thank you so much, panelists again, and our interpreters for doing such a wonderful job today. And thank you everybody who made this webinar possible, asked such interesting questions. We'll see you again with another webinar soon enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Meenal, for being operating to this to organize this event.
Thank you so much, and I'm so
Thank
sorry
you
it was
all.
such less time. I hope we can do more.
Shruti, since you're the host, can you